Hi, my name is Scott Smith, and my favorite thing are the Mission Impossible movies.
Welcome to the Finding Favorites podcast, where we explore your favorite things without using an algorithm. Here's your host, Leah Jones.
Hello and welcome to Finding Favorites. I'm your host, Leah Jones, and this is the podcast where we learn about people's favorite things and get recommendations without using an algorithm. Today, I am joined by one of my first 5 guests, if not I think in the first 5 episodes. He is the host of the Southside reading series, The Front Room, which is co-produced with the Beverly Area Arts Alliance. He has written for Time Out Chicago, Chicago Magazine, Chicagoist, and Playboy, and currently serves as the chief of staff for the Cook County Assessor's Office. You know him as Our Man in Chicago, but his Christian name is Scott Smith. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm well. I'm very glad to be back. I feel like I wanted to do this again, but didn't have a compelling reason. But then I realized as I was rewatching one of my favorite movie franchises and putting together a highlight, this series of IG stories, that I was like, oh yeah. Wait, I think it's this.
Yeah.
And this being the Mission Impossible movies.
Yeah. I think it says I'm worried about you, Scott. I'm going to be honest.
Okay. All right.
Your previous favorite thing was The West Wing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you made it your life and you have become a public servant.
Right.
You're a good bureaucrat.
Thank you.
The type we need in office.
Appreciate that.
And having seen most of the Mission Impossibles, I am worried about what this means for your career future.
Right. No, that's a legitimate concern. I
know you started going to the gym.
Right.
You're working out, you're lifting weights. So I am concerned you will soon be jumping out of trains, off of bridges, into airplanes.
Yep.
But I think that's a part 6 question. But how seriously is this obsession with Mission Impossible?
So I didn't start to really get obsessed with these movies until somewhat recently. I would say the last sort of several years. The movies themselves, I was always sort of like, oh, those are fine. I like action movies, but I'm not a major consumer of them. I've never seen any of the Fast and the Furious movies, although I'm sure I would enjoy them. I know.
You would have a lot of fun.
I know. Christopher Nolan and I could kind of trade bits about it. He's apparently a huge fan. But I really, really enjoy these, and I started to get into them just over the last few years, and I can't explain it. It wasn't like a pandemic thing. It was certainly pre-pandemic, but there was just something about them that just felt extremely compelling, and I think it was when part 3 happens, they really begin to sort of figure out what this series is really about and what it's supposed to do. Yeah. And it kind of clicks in with part 3 and then just kind of goes and goes and goes, and it just keeps building into this, how can we top everything that was done? But unlike a lot of other action movies, and I would assume sort of unlike the Fast and the Furious movies, while these films tried to do something wild, it doesn't get ridiculous because it is largely practical effects. They try to keep the reality of it. Tom Cruise famously does a lot of his own stunts. So there's this real grounding in reality that kind of heightens all the tension about it. So that's why I think it's so kind of grounded in a reality of things. But that's why I've kind of gotten into it, and subsequently over the last couple of movies.
So when you saw part 3, was that the first one you saw in the theaters, or have you seen any of them in the theaters?
I think I've seen most of them in the theaters. I'm an old, so I did see the first one in the theaters.
Yeah.
And liked it, thought it was interesting, was, like most people, somewhat confused by it, because there's all these sort of double backs and all these, kind of misdirects and things like that. So I saw it when I was still in college, and it was, fine. Yeah, it was 1996, so I was in college at that point.
I did not know that the series had been going on for that long.
It has. It's a long time.
Wow. I for sure did not see it then.
So I think what is interesting about these movies is that they've been going on for almost 30 years now, but they sort of didn't really kind of become themselves until about 10 years after the first one came out. So the first one comes out and it's based off the TV series. It's supposed to be a kind of continuation of the series. Brian De Palma directs it, so this sort of person with this kind of famously atmospheric kind of technique takes things really seriously. There's all these kind of like, tilt. I haven't been a movie buff for a while, but all this sort of like tilt shots that he kind of is known for, I think, and there's these famous sequence where he's breaking into the CIA and sort of doing this, wire drop into the CIA. There's the early sequence where he's sort of outrunning an aquarium that has exploded and sort of dumped all this water onto the street. And then the final sequence is this bullet train chase in which he's pursued by the villain who is in a helicopter. Which
he's in a bullet train and the villain is in a helicopter.
Right.
Is he on the top of the train?
He's on the top of the train. He's on the side of the train. There's just various bits. And train chase sequences come up in a couple of different ways in Mission Impossible, particularly this most recent one, in which the climax in Dead Reckoning Part 1, climax is they are on a train that has fallen off of a bridge. And each car is slowly falling off of the bridge. So each subsequent car is just, and they are having, Tom Cruise and his co-star are having to run, basically doing vertical climbing up these train cars fast enough to get to the next train car before it falls off the bridge. And it's just this sequence of them trying to literally, essentially outrun a falling train off of a bridge.
Yeah. This one I did see in the theaters. And I guess we should have said it at the top. Spoilers.
Right.
We're going to spoil all of them.
I won't tell you what happens at the end. I will preserve the integrity of the stunts, but I will mention that there are a number of stunts in these movies. I will not spoil too much plot-wise because I think that's one of the joys of them is finding out these things as they occur. But there are trains in the Mission Impossible movies, so I'm sorry if I spoiled too much there for anybody.
You didn't. You didn't. These are, in some cases, 30-year-old movies. That's painful. But yeah, that most recent one, 6, on some of the podcasts I listened to, and I did see it in the theaters because I am a Regal Unlimited person.
Ooh.
Yes. Which has really lowered the bar for what I'll see in the theaters. It's fabulous. As an old, getting an unlimited movie pass is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, that's nice.
That what they talked about in the months leading up to Mission Impossible 6 is there's always a stunt, a practical stunt that almost kills Tom Cruise. And you go into the movie expecting to see the motorcycle stunt or the running across the rooftop stunt. And then it is not the most remarkable stunt. Like they have tricked you because there's going to be something more remarkable in the movie.
That is absolutely correct. That was 100% correct. And that's what I think is fascinating about these movies. So I have said the fourth movie, which is Ghost Protocol, is the best Mission Impossible movie. As a kind of self-contained movie experience, it is the best of all of them. But there are parts of the individual movies that I enjoy more. Like I think I'm saying this as if you were completely new to the Mission Impossible movies and you wanted to just see like the best of all of them, and you're just want to like see if these are for you, I think 4 is the way to go because it is a very self-contained plot. There is not the latter 5 and 6 and 7 all kind of key off each other in particular ways. And 4 is like they have figured out what they're doing with these movies. They have gotten it to, they sort of honed it to a fine point. And 4 also features truly one of the most incredible stunt sequences on film anywhere, which is Tom Cruise climbing the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa. And it is just he's climbing up pure glass and climbing up the outside of a building to break into a computer server room. And that itself is kind of mind-blowing. But at the second half of the stunt is he has to climb back down into another window, which is where the whole team is.
Yeah.
And there is a point at which he's sort of rappelling down the building with, I believe, a fire hose. So almost a little nod to Die Hard there. But the hose or the rope is not long enough. And he has to figure out a way to basically go 2 floors down and in. And again, I won't spoil how that happens, but it is the sequence that when I watch it, and I have watched these movies multiple times, I still get, like that is still just like, you're like, that man has hurt himself in doing this. Yeah. And it will not be the last time he does this. In the 5th film, Rogue Nation. Is it Rogue Nation? No, it's Fallout. He is famously running across a rooftop, a number of rooftops, pursuing a villain.
In Paris or London or something, right?
Right. And he's running across rooftops, and he jumps from one building to another. And in real life, broke his ankle.
Yeah.
And you see him pull himself up off the building. He has a broken ankle. He is limping. He is still finishing the stunt to get the shot. And they leave that in the movie. So the man has injured himself to the point where they had to stop production, and they kept it in the movie because, first of all, why wouldn't you?
Right.
I'm Tom Cruise. I broke my ankle. I'm like, you're keeping that in the movie. You're going to see me limping off. He just
also, that's what happens when a 50-year-old, 60-year-old man runs and jumps across. Like, the idea that elite spies in movies never get injured.
Right.
I want to see them limp. I want to see them bleed lightly.
So I mentioned Die Hard before, and the reason Die Hard works really well is it's full of a lot of practical effects, and you see John McClane suffer, right? Like, this is a person who's like hurt. Reginald VelJohnson famously says in the movie, he's hurt, he's scared, he's got no support from, I think he says, he's not getting diddly squat from anybody down here. Tom Cruise is sort of superhuman, and in the later movies, they start to kind of explore a little bit about, like, hey, this guy's kind of crazy, but you need his kind of crazy to, like, perform these missions, which I think is a really good way to use the kind of crazy that Tom Cruise has, and which is sort of used to great effect in these movies, but has also sort of made him a somewhat problematic person. But they actually talk about the fact that this guy's like just a little off, and you need that person who's a little off, but he actually deeply cares about individual people. He somehow seems to balance the lives of individual people on his team or people he encounters against the thousands or millions of lives that he's saving by preventing these sort of world catastrophe things.
Right.
But you do see him kind of being unsure and being like looking scared. And I think that's because, like, you can't be, for example, in a helicopter, piloting a helicopter, being chased by another helicopter, doing 360-degree spins and descents in that helicopter, and not have it show on your face that you're a little bit freaked out.
Right. So I pulled up the Wikipedia for the series, and Ghost Protocol had a director I'd never heard of before, Brad Bird. And what's interesting is that Mission Impossible is most of his director credits are animated. Iron Giant, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, Incredibles 2. And so he did this in between Ratatouille and Incredibles 2. And I think it's interesting that for you, like, this is the movie that clicks it in, Ghost Protocol. And it's also the one that brings in a director from animation who can probably, I bet an animation guy can go beat for beat with Tom Cruise on thinking through big stunts. And then there's a way in which an animator has to break down how are we going to make it happen through drawing that probably translates, I bet it was an interesting collaboration between an animator and Tom Cruise.
Animations have to be pretty meticulously planned. And these movies are meticulously planned. So I think you're right. I think there is that carryover. And if you go watch Incredibles 2, you start to see like where, especially if you watch Incredibles 1 and then 2, you see kind of what happened in the actions in the movies that he's kind of done. He brings that then to Incredibles. So it is interesting to see like what got, there's so much almost like cartoonishly, not silly, but almost just sort of in the scope of them, the stunts in Ghost Protocol. There's a car chase, but it's in a sandstorm, and he's using like a GPS thing to see where the car is because he can't actually see where the car actually is. At the end of the movie, the final scene takes place in a parking garage, and it's like this sort of, imagine a kind of car tower, and they have these elevators that bring the cars in and out. And so there's like these series of elevators, and there's these falling cars, and he and the villain are like fighting on top of these cars and falling different levels and things. And it's all because he's trying to get this briefcase to prevent a missile from hitting San Francisco and starting a global nuclear war. So there's like falling cars and crashes, and it has this sort of like not like super real, almost sort of beyond the real world kind of feel to it. But because it's all practical, because Tom Cruise is largely doing his own stunts, it's really, really grounded at the same time. So it never becomes a sort of fully cartoonish experience. And I think that's why Ghost Protocol works so well, is there's all these things that are just outlandishly staged, but still feel very real. You can kind of see the pain on in him. There's, I don't think this is a spoiler, but the very end of the sequence, this sort of guy who's been a foil for Tom Cruise throughout the movie, not a villain, but a sort of, guy who's been pursuing Tom Cruise, is like, should we take you to the hospital? And Tom Cruise is just kind of like, ugh. Like he's like, I'm hurt. I'm busted up. I didn't walk away from this. I'm lying down throughout the end of this sequence because I can't get up. I have busted like he's hurt and injured. Shows up in the next sequence. They're talking about the fact that he's injured. So there's just like this really, I would say if anybody's new and you're like, I don't even know where to start. There's 7 movies. Start with 4, and then you can kind of go work your way back through. We talked about the first one. It's very dated. Like it has this like, have you guys heard of the internet? Kind of thing.
Right.
It's if you've seen The Net with Sandra Bullock, it's very much that kind of vibe to it. But there's some things in there the use of masks is big in that one. These very outlandish scenes, these sort of not bigger than life villains, but villains that have these like very clear goals that seem really kind of achievable. These movies are big because there's always a team that gets assembled. Each of the team has sort of their own little specialty. So 1 is fine. I would say 2 is still just the worst of the bunch.
Okay.
And the one that I almost never go back to. I think I've seen it. I did see it in the theater. It was terrible. It's a John Woo directed movie, but it's like really lesser John Woo. And apparently he had filmed a 3-hour version of it. And the studio was like, no, this is not how this is going to go. You got to cut this thing down. And so in cutting it down, you lose a lot of kind of the movie. But it's also just very, like, the sound and the music is all very kind of just very dated. And it came out like in 2000. So it just has this very like Limp Bizkit-y feel to it in a lot of ways. Tom Cruise has a very unfortunate mullet. It's nobody's finest hour here. And it just drags. And that's like the cardinal sin of a movie like this, where it's just, you're a good 20 minutes in before he finally he kind of gets together with his first team member. There's a really incredible sequence where he's rock climbing, which is fine, but it's just there to show Tom Cruise rock climbing.
Right.
And it doesn't
it's not moving the story forward.
Right. I don't have a problem with that, but it's just, there's not a lot going on in that.
Yep.
And you contrast that with what I think is the best opening sequence of any Mission Impossible movie, which is in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, where, and most people are probably just sort of aware of, Tom Cruise is hanging off of the side of a plane as it is taking off. And so he's on the plane's on the ground and it takes off and he's holding onto the side of the plane and has to get into the plane.
Through like the wheel well or something, right?
No, they end up opening a side door. And he gets like sucked into the plane because that door is open and slams into the inside of the plane, which is another kind of thing. Like oftentimes in other kinds of movies, the person would like jump into the thing and they maybe land on their feet and it like looks cool. It's sort of what you get in a lot of the James Bond films, which I also enjoy, but this is a very different thing. But no, he gets sucked into the plane and like slammed into the side of the plane as he's doing it. And you could take that sequence and cut it out of the movie. It doesn't really. It's sort of it starts the action a little bit because what he's reacquired in that sequence is like, oh, hey, you got these things that these guys were trying to use. And it turns out there's no way these guys could have gotten it themselves. So we think they're working with this big syndicate and everything. So you could still cut that out and it doesn't really lose anything. But the fact that they use that as a cold open versus the first big stunt sequence in 2, which is like he's rock climbing and then he gets the fancy little glasses that's how he gets his mission and everything.
Right.
It's just like very clear, like you can have a cold open that doesn't have anything to do with the plot and still make it really interesting and compelling and one of the best stunt sequences in the thing. But as you point out later on, people think, oh, I'm going for this. The big sequence of this Mission Impossible movie is going to be Tom Cruise hanging off the side of the plane.
Right.
And it turns out, no, there's also
the first 2 minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
First 2 minutes. And then we're off to the races.
Right.
There's also an underwater heist in which in the movie, Tom Cruise, the character, has to hold his breath for 2 minutes.
Nope. Hard pass.
Right.
Cannot
but here's the thing. In order to film those sequences, Tom Cruise learned to hold his breath for 6 minutes at a time. And there is behind the scenes footage of him training to do that. And he's got his face down in water. And there's a timer running along the bottom. So you can see how long he's training to actually do this.
They also did that. Cast members did that also for, I think, Avatar: Way of Water. And then maybe that most recent Marvel movie that was also underwater. Black Panther.
Okay.
The Black Panther one that had underwater stuff. And all of those stories just make my bones turn into jelly. Just thinking about putting on a lead vest, because James Cameron has them like in the pool. It's not just hold your face in water like Tom Cruise was doing. It's like they go into a pool and they submerge their whole, because they had to be like, it's just the amount of training to do that and to be able to go for 6 minutes. Like that is his dedication to the stunts is remarkable. And you're right. You have to be a little bit crazy to think it's worthwhile.
Yeah. He's in this sequence. He's basically breaking into an underwater safe and they have to basically put a profile into this computer essentially so that one of the other team members can break into this other place. Yeah. So he's swimming around in this underwater, call it some kind of a big container, and he has to open this safe and swap these cards and hold his breath the entire time he's swinging. There's like these, I don't even know what you call them, sort of dollies that are swinging through this container of water that he's also having to duck the entire time. And I will not spoil what happens in this sequence because, again, I think it's worth to see it. But the crazy thing is he comes out of that sequence and I will just say that his life is in danger in a very significant way in this sequence. He's had to be resuscitated and then jumps into a car and has one of the great car chases in the Mission Impossible movies. That has been sort of in this most recent one. I think there's a kind of callback to that. It's an incredible car chase, and then the car chase ends, and immediately a motorcycle chase begins. Jesus. And he is on this motorcycle, a chase for which they had to disable the safety features on the motorcycle in order to pull off some of the sequences in the movie.
Wow.
And that all happens, and then there's a huge kind of chase sequence at the very end of the movie where they have to capture this villain, which is just like fun and great. But that's another example. Like 5 is a great example of the big set piece you think you're going to see in this movie. that is just one piece of it. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to be underwater. And then immediately followed by an insane car chase and then a motorcycle chase right after it.
Wow.
And I think that's why 4 is my favorite, because it kind of sets up that kind of breakneck pace. There's a point when 4 kind of begins its plot that it's like go, 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 go. All this, like he climbs up the skyscraper. There's this sort of meeting he has with the bad guys. And then there's a chase sequence. And this is when they're going through the dust storm. And just all this stuff kind of goes boom, 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 one right after the other. There's very little kind of like catch your breath kind of stuff that happens in it. And then 5 just kind of takes that and cranks up the sort of intensity of it. And I do want to, I think it then kind of 6 then becomes the way that they kind of try to top that. So there is this sort of like escalating thing that happens with 4, 5, and 6, where they're just really, truly, you feel them trying to top themselves.
Well, that's also 4, 5, or I want to get back to this. I have this chart. Wikipedia has a chart. Starting with Rogue Nation.
Right. The 5th one.
And on, Christopher McQuarrie is the director.
Right.
He is the writer. And then, Tom Cruise is always one of the producers. But this is also true in Fast and the Furious movies, that once you land on and find the right director and you get them on board for the rest of the series, and they take some real ownership, and it's not Brad Bird trying to top J.J. Abrams or John Woo, who came before him. It's Christopher McQuarrie and Tom Cruise brainstorming, where is this going?
Exactly. There's a real sense in the 5th one that they have kind of they have not just the creative team that really knows how to make these movies, but on screen, you've got Tom Cruise, you've got Ving Rhames, who is the only other actor who's been in all of the other Mission Impossible movies. And then you have Simon Pegg, who starts off in 3 playing this guy Benji, who is sort of, not quite like a Q in the James Bond movies, but he's a sort of technology guy in the lab who's kind of helping Tom Cruise. He's kind of a helper guy that's on the phone a lot. And in 4, he ends up becoming a field agent, and then he is subsequently in the rest of the movies. And so I think that's what also starts to really click about these movies is you've got, an actor and producer who really kind of is the keeper of these movies. He's found a director and a writer that he really gels well with. And Tom Cruise has worked with McQuarrie on a couple of other things. He's also, McQuarrie has done like some pretty fantastic writing work. He wrote The Usual Suspects. He's done some other really great stuff. He and Tom Cruise worked on Jack Reacher. Yep. They did Top Gun together. They did Jack Reacher. They did Edge of Tomorrow. So this is somebody he's got like a really good, he's over the last, I would say, probably 10, 15 years, Tom Cruise has been working with Christopher McQuarrie like a lot. So he kind of knows his rhythm. They kind of know what each other's capable of. So that's another reason why I think these movies really, really work well. I do want to say, though, that 3 is a nice, like, kind of gets back to or starts to create the template of what these movies are. After 2, which was like both financially and more so critically just a real huge disappointment, 3 kind of takes the stakes down a little bit in that Tom Cruise starts the movie. He's not in the field anymore. He's training field agents. He gets pulled back into the field to rescue somebody he trained and certified for field work. And through that ends up, getting back into the field and goes head to head with just one of the best, I think the best villain in the series, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, is a guy named Owen Davian, who, and this is another kind of genius thing about this movie, is they're after something called the Rabbit's Foot. And it's never really explained what the Rabbit's Foot is. It's just sort of a classic MacGuffin. And they come up with some of these fantastic stunt sequences that are really then what Mission Impossible is about. So there's this incredible chase that happens in the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. At one point, Tom Cruise is outrunning a missile that's launched at him, like a shoulder missile. And the explosion pushes, basically, the force of it slams him into a car. And this is actually Tom Cruise performing this stunt. The way they did it, they kind of strapped wires to him and yanked him into this car so that it looks like it's, the missile explodes and the force of it blows him into this car. That's like the main huge sequence in that movie. But there's also a heist / kidnapping in the Vatican. So they have to break into the Vatican, which starts this series of like, what's this crazy place that we can break into thing that keeps coming up in the Mission Impossible movies. And then there's also this sort of like, it's a little bit tough to explain it, but they create a sort of fulcrum, and Tom Cruise jumps off a building and sort of ends up bungee jumping onto another building. So he jumps, free falls, gets yanked by this bungee cord, and kind of does a 180-degree swing and then drops onto another building in order to break into the building and steal this thing called the Rabbit's Foot. So there's all these like wild, in the air, he's jumping off of a building, out of a plane thing. That's kind of begins a setup in 3, and in subsequent movies, there's usually like he's jumping off of a thing, or it's not just a car chase. There's usually tons of explosions and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So 3, they sort of start to figure out what these movies are about, and that's the J.J. Abrams one. The Brad Bird one, Ghost Protocol, follows it, and they start to figure this out. And then 5 is when he gets together with McQuarrie, and really they start to just continue to figure out, how do we keep amping these things up? And the sort of apex of that is really part 6, which is called Fallout. It's a continuation in a lot of ways of what happens in part 5. They capture this villain, and there's a transfer of this villain to he's basically been, kind of renditioned by various governments, and they're transferring him from one place to another. And Tom Cruise has to essentially kidnap him from custody, this guy that he put into custody in the first place. So it's a really, this is what I say, like, start with 4, because 5 and 6 kind of start to ping off of each other.
Right.
But by that point in the movie, you have already had what they call a halo jump. He is jumped out of a plane, high altitude, low opening.
Okay.
So he jumps out of a plane at 25,000 feet, but does not open the parachute until he gets to 2,000 feet.
Nope. Hard pass.
That is an actual thing that Tom Cruise learned how to do. It is a thing that people in the military are trained to do. Right. He had to learn how to do that. It's not just like a thing you can practice for a little bit. That's another reason why these movies take like 3 to 5 years to make. Right. Is there's all this plotting, but then he has to do all this like intensive training. And then, again, you're like, oh, well, that's the big thing in the movie. He's going to halo jump out of a plane into Paris. That's going to be the big thing. Oh, no. The end features the greatest stunt sequence in all of the Mission Impossible movies, the helicopter chase. Right. It is one guy, Tom Cruise, chasing another guy in a helicopter. Both people are in a helicopter. It is a helicopter chase.
Yeah.
There's like, oh, car chases? Great. That's fine. But we're the Mission Impossible movies. We're going to chase people in helicopters. Right. So he had to learn how to fly a helicopter, but also had to learn how to do it. He had to do this 360-degree spin as he's descending in the helicopter. It's insane. And it's him actually doing it. And oh, by the way, he's also operating the cameras that are in the helicopter, filming the sequence at the same time.
Right. So that he is the only person putting his life at risk.
Correct.
Because it's helicopters I'm taking a big trip this summer and have been thinking like, ooh, do I want to like take the 13-minute helicopter ride? And I'm like, they're so dangerous. Like helicopters are so dangerous. So the idea of like, oh, I'll just casually, and no, there's nothing casual about it. Like learn how to fly a helicopter and then learn how to stunt pilot a helicopter, right? And manage the GoPros and the cameras. And like, it's just a level of focus and risk that I am not capable of either.
Right. So you're like, oh, should I go ride in a helicopter while someone else pilots it? I don't know. Yeah. But then like Tom Cruise is like, yeah, I'm going to learn how to fly. Also learn how to stunt fly.
Yeah.
And also make sure that I'm helping I'm basically filming this thing at the same time.
It's wild.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to ask you, when you've been watching them recently, is it a family affair? Is this like Aaron and AG have gone to bed and now you're watching alone? Is it a 3-movie night? Is it a triple feature? Like, what's your, or is it, I'm going to throw on a best of Mission Impossible stunts on YouTube? Like, how do you consume Mission Impossible now?
Great question. I typically, up until very recently, have kind of consumed these by myself. It's very much like the family's gone to bed. I'm just going to watch this. I'm going to relax. It's, there's a lot of people talk about binge watching or rewatching shows you've watched a lot of times before. And it's something in the familiar of it that feels very relaxing. I find these movies to be incredibly relaxing, even though there are these literal death-defying stunts that are in them and that they are just like boom, 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 boom all the time. I have like occasionally put them on to fall asleep to.
Sure.
Not usually at night, but just if I have to if I'm like, I really could just use like a quick recharge, I'll put them on just to fall asleep to, and the familiarity of all the dialogue is good. But recently I have Erin agreed to watch some of them with me. She'd seen the third one a very long time ago. But I was like, well, let's start watching these. She is not good with tension in movies.
Sure.
She's very not good with action movies. Getting her to watch Die Hard, it wasn't that she's like, oh, I don't like those movies. Those are like dude movies. Or she was just like, I don't know if my heart and blood pressure can take it.
Sure.
Eventually got her to watch Die Hard. That was a good entry point in Mission Impossible. And generally, she is just like, as she's watching these movies, swearing, exclaiming loudly. We were watching Fallout last night for the first time, me for the 12th, and she just kept taking her hat, her baseball cap off, and putting it back on again, just as like a stress response. I think at one point said, "Why does Tom Cruise have to Tom Cruise so hard?"
Yeah.
But also, it's fascinating to me because there is a level of like, she enjoys the adrenaline rush of it a little bit, a little bit like a riding a roller coaster, right? Like you're like, oh, I hate this, but also there's something about it that fires you up enough to really get into it.
Yeah.
Abigail is not at all interested, not interested at all.
Boring dad movies.
Thinks it's boring, yeah.
Yeah.
But Erin has gotten into them enough that she's gotten into the kind of lore of them as well. There's an ongoing plot thread through 3, 4, 5, and 6 about Tom Cruise is the person he marries in the movies. That is, it kind of comes up again, and she's like, oh, this is happening because that and this, and so I'm enjoying them in a different new way because I'm seeing them. I'm watching her watch it for the first time,
right?
And she'll be like, well, is this because of this, and is he going to do that, or is that guy going to this, and I won't tell her because I want her to just sort of experience it, and she gets irritated at me. So this is like, it's super fun to be able to do that. But I will typically I will rewatch these in kind of parts. I won't do like them back to back. I'll just kind of casually put them on just to relax more than anything.
Yeah. I'm with Erin on my friend Ronnie and I see a lot of action movies because before we got Regal Unlimited, they are not a sponsor, but I do love the membership I paid for. Like, we would prioritize
They should
action.
Sponsor this though. They should. I'm gonna just put that out there. I'm just gonna say if they're smart, they will sponsor this. But go on.
That we prioritized action movies for theaters because that's what you want, the big screen and the sound that moves you, and right. So we would prioritize them. And it's a movie. It's an American Hollywood movie. It all turns out okay. Like, that's the promise going in. It's not a European action movie where it may not, right? It's the promise of Hollywood is people survive generally in an action movie. And I get this also when I listen to memoirs of people that go through horrible things. Where like you get to the chapter that's like the worst thing that ever happened in your life. And you're like, oh no, are they going to die? And you're like, I am listening to the person who wrote the book, read the book to me.
Right.
I know they survive this chapter, but I don't believe they're going to survive. And that sort of tension when you're watching one of these movies where it's like, I saw the press tour. He has both arms and a face. Like, I know he survives this, but it's so compelling in the moment that you're in it, and you are not sure that what you know to be true is true.
There is something about the Mission Impossible movies that do give you that, like, I don't really know if they're going to come out of this, because they're, even though you know it, just the feeling of it, it doesn't feel like it when you're watching them. And I think that does start with 4 and kind of keeps going through there. I think there's a really good way in which these movies put people in peril in a way that has stakes, but in a way that's not like, oh, the woman is in peril, or that, or isn't that. I think the series, for the most part, starting with about 4, does well by the women in it, because each of the, particularly in 5 and 6, there's a character called Ilsa Faust who's introduced in a fairly new, into the beginning of the movie in part 5, where she is introduced as really kind of Tom Cruise's, Ethan Hunt's equal. And is, as you know, is not like a Bond girl. It is very much she's on par with him. And as the movies go on, particularly in 7, the one that just came out, in Dead Reckoning Part 1, they do actually get into like, oh, these folks might not all make it. There is actually this sense of, the one thing they could do is actually say, you know what, not everybody might make it out to the end of this movie. And I respected that about this one. I did not enjoy part 7 as much as the other ones in 3 through 6. I think the villain, and the great thing about the Mission Impossible movies is 3 through 6 have all had really compelling villains. And you kind of get where they're coming from. Some of them are just crazy madmen, but they are, worthy adversaries. And this one, the main enemy is an AI essentially.
Yeah.
But there's like a human stand-in for him, and it like in the movie, it's not really clear, at least as I was watching it, is the human stand-in actually the person controlling it, or is the AI the real villain behind it was just like it was doing something that the other Mission Impossible movies haven't done, and it just felt a little like, this is one of those you're going to go back and watch it in a few years and be like, yeah, the AI villain kind of feels dated. It feels very of its time. Whereas 3 through 6 don't have that. You can go back and watch those because of the practical effects, because they're kind of rooted in these sort of classic, like, oh, this guy's going to release this virus that's going to do this terrible thing, or, this guy wants to, basically blow up the world. They're all kind of classic, supervillain type things. Whereas this is like, oh, and we're fighting this AI that can kind of be anywhere and do anything. It does kind of try to get into that, like, you don't know what you can trust. You don't know. The great thing about the Mission Impossible movies, we haven't talked about this much, but they have all these masks, and they've created these like hyper realistic masks, and you think you're watching one character, and then the sequence ends and the character pulls off the mask and it turns out to be somebody else. And as much as you know that that's happening in these movies, it still kind of is a surprise. So you're like, I don't know what I can trust. I don't know if this is actually happening or not. And they kind of have that with this AI thing, but you're like, there's just sort of this off-screen thing that's screwing with the characters on screen, and it's just sort of like, it's not as compelling as watching people kind of go toe-to-toe with each other and sort of outthink each other.
Yeah.
So it is worth seeing. Again, 2 incredible stunt sequences. I mentioned the thing with the train, but the main one that people kind of were like going into it thinking about was this motorcycle jump.
Yeah.
Where Tom Cruise basically like rides a motorcycle up a mountain and then jumps off the mountain with the motorcycle and then parachutes onto more like a parasails onto the train. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely incredible. And the fun thing about these movies is you're not sure, like, that he's doing that stunt, but you're like, what in this stunt is being done to keep him from dying? Like, in some of the stunts, he does do wire work. They take those out, digitally, for the movie. but he is jumping out of a thing or jumping over a thing.
Right.
Obviously there's the height of this thing he's jumping off of is real. It is scary. It is death-defying. They are worth seeing just for the sort of outlandishness of the stunt sequences.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say like it's not worth going to seeing part 7, but 3 through 6 are just perfect.
Nice. Is there anything else about the Mission Impossible franchise that you haven't mentioned that you would be so sad not to have mentioned?
I think, I mentioned these last few have really kind of dialed in the team. They've really dialed in the idea of, the way they deal with women has been really great. There is this sense of just like the Tom Cruisiness of it. Mm-hmm. And just they do really kind of recognize like this character, Ethan Hunt, is a little crazy, which is a nice key off of like, yeah, Tom Cruise is a little crazy because you can't do these things without being a little crazy. I think the other thing about these movies, particularly if you do end up seeing all of them, is there are nice callbacks. This most recent one features 2 characters from the first one, in one in a really kind of great way, and then another in a sort of like subtle callback kind of way. There's all these little things that they kind of reward a like true Mission Impossible fan, a super fan, in a way that doesn't feel like fan service or doesn't feel like kind of like haha wink wink. It feels it in a way that's just like, oh yeah, if you know, you know.
Yeah.
So I think it's another reason why these movies are so great. I would, if you're new, I would start with 4. If you watch 4 and you're not like, okay, yep, the rest of them aren't going to be for you, start with 4. If that's in your wheelhouse, I'd say go back and watch 3, and then 5 and 6, go to 7, and then 1 is certainly worth seeing just because you kind of see how the whole thing began.
Right.
It's pretty dated. I mean, there's floppy disks.
Right.
There's a weird way they deal with the internet. And then 2 is just sort of like this. Watching 2, and I started watching a little bit of it again today. It just feels like off-brand Mission Impossible. It just feels like the it's the dollar store Mission Impossible movie.
Well, also, if you think about when the first one came out, everybody was like, what do you mean they're making it? It was sort of the same as when Batman went from the Adam West Batman to Michael Keaton Batman, that Mission Impossible was a comedy spy show on network TV where it was guns in your shoes, and like it was like Batman in the 1960s. So it was a spy comedy. It wasn't, I don't think, quite a sitcom. It wasn't a sitcom.
Well, okay, so hang on. I have to interrupt you because you're confusing it with Get Smart.
Get Smart. Oh, no.
So Get Smart was sort of the comedy version of Mission Impossible.
Okay.
So Mission Impossible, the TV series, definitely had the mask and they had the gadgets and stuff like that. It was more of a dramatic series, but Get Smart was the comedy. Get Smart was the sort of Adam West Batman version almost of Mission Impossible. But you're right in that people were like, do we really need this? Like this was like really the beginning of this sort of more modern period of taking old IP and turning it into like a rebooted thing. So there was a little bit of like, do we really need this? So you're right on that. And I think it is interesting to sort of go, they did create a bigger scope with this. But then I think 2 comes out and almost kind of sinks the whole idea. And so the fact that they were able to resuscitate it with 3 is really kind of something.
Martin Landau.
Oh, classic actor.
Okay, so the original Mission Impossible was not Get Smart.
Correct. That is correct. Peter Graves, the actor who plays Jim Phelps in the original TV series, was also in the Airplane movies. The Jim Phelps character is in the first Mission Impossible, so it is trying to kind of continue the TV series in that way. So it was really trying to say, like, this is a continuation of what was going on in the TV series. So it's got a real similar tone. And then it kind of goes off into its own direction by the end and kind of creates its own kind of lore and everything.
Okay. Well, thank you for fixing that in my brain.
I just think that it's funny because I knew I was like I don't think it was that funny, but I mean it was light, and I was like, oh, I know exactly where she's going with this because we're the same age, and like Get Smart was on like afternoon channel 32,
absolutely,
and like it was on all the time, and yeah, so I mean that kind of spy, tongue in cheek kind of spy stuff. I think we're very well versed in because of that show.
Yeah. Have you ever seen OSS 117?
No.
It is a French spy satire.
Okay.
So it's sort of a James Bond. It's a satire, a French satire of James Bond that they made modern. So it was a 1960s film series. And in 2006, they released one called Nest of Spies.
Okay.
And it was distributed by Music Box. So Music Box Theater has an international film distribution arm.
Okay, I did not know that.
I taught them how to use social media in the early aughts. And it's a really fun French spy action movie.
So this is fascinating because this is definitely like a version of what was done with the Mission Impossible, because it looks like they were books, and then they were like serious films, but then there was this whole like parody comedy series that was launched with the same name.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just if you're looking for like kind of in the world of what do we do with Cold War, it is an interesting question of like, who is the enemy? Because Mission Impossible original series, anything that was like created during the Cold War, right? It's the Russians. And now in the action movies, right, they make a very diverse team so that it'll work in almost any country, right? Fast and Furious is so diverse because they want it to have a global box office. And the enemy is no longer strongly stated, right? In Top Gun, it was a made-up country, right? It was just a mysterious country with a valley.
Yeah.
And now it's AI, which was also the villain in the movie The Creator. So there's something interesting about when action movies are made for a global audience, the reluctance to make the villain a person, because then that is a country that won't go to the movie to see it.
Right. And the Mission Impossible movies do have a lot of that in the way that they get their funding, and they're very careful to sort of not make certain there's a lot of kind of they're sort of Russian, or they're, the last couple are the villains are ex-spies, ex-British Secret Service, actually.
Right.
Or ex-British intelligence, so MI6. So they've really kind of been like sort of British, sort of Russian, maybe a little German in there, all sort of kind of European. By the way, I would be remiss if I didn't, again, stump for Ghost Protocol being the best one. And one of the main reasons is, much like how they broke into the Vatican in part 3, the way they top that in part 4 is they break into the Kremlin.
Oh.
And I, again, I don't want to spoil anything, but the Kremlin comes out a lot worse for the wear by the end of that sequence. That is all I will say. But it is, and it's bonkers what happens. Nice. And it also features one of the great tech gadget things where they basically like create this like weird mirror effect thing that's like they have a giant projector screen that they use to fake out a guard and allow them to break into the Kremlin. It's just weird and goofy and fantastic. It's so breaking into the Kremlin, Burj Khalifa climb, parking garage ending. Why part 4 is just the absolute best. And I would say folks who are new should definitely start with that one.
Outstanding. And I think given that the next one is coming out May of 25, people have a year to prepare. You don't have to, you've got more than a week's notice to get your homework done in preparation for part 8.
Yes. And I'd say go to 4, 3, so Ghost Protocol, 3, Rogue Nation, Fallout, Dead Reckoning, and then go back and watch parts 1 and then see the really terrible part 2. if you've really gone down the rabbit hole by then.
Yeah. Scott, do you want people to find you on the internet, or do you have anything you'd like to promote?
Not. I would actually prefer people not find me.
All right.
No, that I do use Our Man in Chicago on various internet platforms. ourmaninchicago.net, where I occasionally put a piece of writing. Our Man in Chicago on Instagram,
where people can see your Mission Impossible missives.
Right. The sort of demo version of this very podcast of when I was IG storying various memories of or various thoughts and musings on the Mission Impossible franchise.
And people should follow the Front Room, your reading series, and come out for that.
Yes. The next one is April 18th at the Beverly Arts Center. It is 7:30 p.m. We feature 5 storytellers from the South Side of Chicago. It's been going for not quite as long as the Mission Impossible movies, but it's been going for 9 years. It is a true labor of love, and one of just a thing that I personally I like putting it together, and I like kind of seeing how it all comes together. So much like the Mission Impossible movies, I've assembled a team, each with a unique set of skills, to create an not sort of death-defying, but very good stories about what the South Side really is. And so people can go to the Front Room to see that, or if you search for the Front Room on Facebook, you'll find more details about the event.
Outstanding. You can find Finding Favorites wherever podcasts are given away freely. Please subscribe, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or on Good Pods, or give it a 5 stars on Spotify. You can find me, find the podcast on Instagram, Finding Faves Pod, FINDINGFAVSPOD, Finding Faves Pod. You can follow me at Shy Leah, CHILEAH on Instagram, Chicago Leah on TikTok, and Blue Sky. I don't understand how to tell you my username, but I'm there too. If you would like to sponsor a future episode, whether you're Regal Unlimited or just a fan, it costs $100 to put an episode out in the world. You can Venmo me at Leah Jones 1 or PayPal or Zelle. I'm more than happy to accept sponsorship and patronage for the future of Finding Favorites podcast, which I love putting together. It is engineered by Rob Abrazado, and keep enjoying your favorite things.
Thank you for listening to Finding Favorites with Leah Jones. Please make sure to subscribe and drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Now, go out and enjoy your favorite things.